Welcome back to another episode of Flashpoint History's War of the Worlds. This is episode 3, The Moors of Andalusia. In our last episode, we talked about how the Islamic conquest finally managed to take out all of North Africa. And in this episode, that expansion continues into the rich lands of Spain as the armies of the Caliphate extend the empire's borders to the edges of the known world. We are going to begin this episode with the story of a people that had been displaced. There was once a great nation that, as Shakespeare would one day say of Julius Caesar, would bestride the world like a giant colossus. Its people were initially hardworking and industrious, committed and pragmatic. Their resourcefulness allowed them to grow from a small city-state known as Rome to a vast territory that incorporated hundreds, if not thousands, of cultures and ethnicities. Now this wasn't going to be an easy path. Every avenue and road and field was stained with blood as the fledgling republic had to fight her way to dominance. But along the way, and you can even argue that this was a consequence of her own success, driven and uncompromising, and add to this ruthless men changed that republic into an empire. She was now driven by a single emperor, which would have been the antithesis of her founders. Of course, with good leaders, the empire would flourish, but with bad ones, the empire would begin to crack. The people that the Romans had come to dominate waited like jackals at the periphery of a campfire, awaiting that time to strike. And by the 3rd and 4th century of the Common Era, the fire of civilization, or subjugation, depending on how you looked at it, that was the Pax Romana, began to ebb. And with the dimming of that light, barbarians began to appear on the horizon, their voices like their armies growing in strength, all wanting their piece of a once mighty empire. The barbarians that came had a lot of names. The Vandals, the Alans, the Huns. But amongst these invaders was a group called the Visigoths. The Visigoths were once an agricultural tribe that lived in an area that would one day be the country of Romania. They were, however, attacked by the Huns, and as they say, one doesn't know true fear unless you've been on the business end of a Hunnic attack. They were forced to flee. They went south to the border of the Roman Empire, which was then demarcated by the river Danube. And Emperor Valens, who was the main man in charge at this point, seeing this as an opportunity to expand the potential manpower for his army and incorporate a new ally, the Romans would call this a foederati, allowed them to cross the river and settle into Roman territory. But his subordinates, seeing this as a chance to exploit a displaced and refugee people, the type of people that really didn't have any other options, instigated harsh and insanely cruel terms. They were the slumlords of the worst variety, and when the Visigoths couldn't pay the rent or afford, food, in some cases were forced to sell their own children into slavery in order to make ends meet. They were forced to live in just deplorable conditions, denied weapons, and repressed in a multitude of ways. But like with many other examples of human resilience, their spirit was not diminished, and eventually they rallied together and under a leader named Fritigern were able to fight back. On August 9th, in the year 378, Valens, who was now eager for victory and to crush this upstart rebellion, rushed in his exhausted troops to take on what he thought was a much smaller barbarian army, but he was deceived. And by his own scouts, nonetheless, they failed to spot the Visigoth cavalry. The Battle of Adrianople, which is one of those notable battles in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, found the Roman army surprised. Fritigern had ordered a smokescreen created by burning the scrub grassland, and from this, Goth horsemen appeared seemingly from nowhere. Unaware and thus unprepared, the Roman cavalry was quickly routed from the field, and the Roman infantry found itself attacked on both flanks by enemy cavalry just as the main body of the Visigoth army came barreling down into them. Roman historians estimated that two-thirds of their army was lost, but I'm guessing that the real number was likely higher, as they probably wanted to downplay their massive defeat. But what the Romans couldn't hide that day was that Valens, the emperor himself, was killed alongside his men. This defeat would be a big one for the empire, and the way I looked at it, this was just the beginning of karma. The Romans knew that they now had to play nice, or at least respect the Visigoths a little bit more, and allowed them to settle in the Balkans in exchange for manning the role of guard duty along the frontier. But the Visigoths knew that they couldn't trust the Romans. Would you? And again, waited for their moment to strike. When the great empire was split into two with the death of Emperor Theodosius I in 379, the eastern and western halves were weakened. The Visigoths began to move again, down south and eventually into Italy, and meeting only scant resistance along the way, they marched on the city of Rome, and in 410 sacked and then plundered the once spectacular capital. And by the way, this was the first time in 800 years that the sanctity of Rome was violated. The Western Empire was indeed crumbling. Emperor Honorius, who, if you look in the pantheon of great emperors of Roman history, you're not going to find him, realized that the Goths actually had some sort of battlefield utility. He made a treaty with them, offered them a considerable amount of cash, and then sent them into the Iberian Peninsula to deal with the Germanic tribes that had already overrun what was once a Roman province. The Visigoths, who were now a military power to be recognized, made short work of these tribes and were then duly awarded with lands in southern Gaul. But their days in France were to be numbered as another Germanic tribe known as the Franks muscled their way in. The Visigoths now proceeded to move down into Spain for good. Of course, this move wasn't going to be without some sort of challenge. After all, we are talking about the early Middle Ages here, where just about everyone was out for some carnage. The Romans of the Eastern Empire, to be named later the Byzantine, would later try to retake Spain under their auspicious and very capable Emperor Justinian. But this attempt was eventually turned back because the Visigoths were getting organized. In 568, there was a Goth king named Leovigild who came to power. He fought the Romans and many of the local tribes. He even put down a revolt that was led by his own son in order to bring a majority of Spain under Visigoth rule. And he managed all this by the year 586. The government structure that was implemented was surprisingly stable and would last for approximately 150 years. Of course, there were problems that were inherent to its design, as the king was usually elected by the nobility. A dynastic structure, where the king would put his own son in place after him, was only tolerated sparingly. So, every time the king would die, or more likely be found murdered and then dumped into the nearest river, because being a Goth king was something that had the capacity to be hazardous to one's health, the country would then have the potential to go into civil war, or there'd be a considerable amount of infighting. It was one of those situations where the nobles would await a weakened rival to show them the meaning of mortality. Visigoth Spain was a proto-feudal society where her kings would try to incorporate some of the remnants of the governing style of the old Roman Empire. But the armies, which were in many cases local militia, were led by a local lord that, in theory at least, would then band together to fight opposition to the kingdom as a whole. But again, these forces would retain loyalty to their own local leader. So at this point, I want you to take a minute and imagine what Spain was like. This is one of those close your eyes and imagine moments, as long as you're not operating a vehicle. After all, this was a major transition point. We all seem to have it ingrained in our minds to think of civilization to be this relentlessly improving, in one direction, what most would call progress. But instead, with the fall of the Roman Empire, we were entering into what some would consider to be the Dark Ages. For civilization, and I use that term in the broadest sense possible, it can be argued that this was a step backwards. Hispania became something like a post-apocalyptic movie. Okay, maybe not quite so harsh, and definitively more drawn out in terms of time. You didn't have zombies walking around, but instead what you had was a loss of the high society and technology that she once enjoyed under the Romans. As a whole, she went into decline, and on multiple fronts. Her agricultural abilities diminished as she lost the technologies to maintain irrigation systems and to farm the land. The population was also ravaged by infighting and barbarian attacks and plague. Her economy turned inwards and small as the markets that she once had within the framework of the Roman Empire became too dangerous or perilous to engage in. Mining was going to be another area that wasn't going to do very well. I mean, after all, this was one of the major reasons that a lot of people came to the peninsula. It was very rich in silver, and the Romans had mined the land to a level that would not be rivaled until the time of the Industrial Revolution. Now, it goes without saying that infrastructure was also going to take a hit. Roads and bridges and canals were also neglected, and in some places abandoned altogether. But despite all these problems, Spain remained a cosmopolitan place. Her population now included Greek, Carthaginian, Roman, Celt-Iberian, Lusitanian, and now Gothic influences. As a whole, she remained strong up until about the year 710. In the year 710 is when we start to hit some major political upheaval. It was in this year that the Visigoth king Watiza died, and his son Aquila was next in line to take power. Now, records of the time period are not entirely clear what exactly happened. It is known, however, that a prominent nobleman named Roderick swooped down to claim the throne. Roderick was a duke of a large area in southern Spain known as Baetica. He moved quickly, and in some accounts had himself proclaimed king before anybody could actually do anything about it. His move, however, engendered considerable resentment and split the kingdom. News of this discord spread fast, especially into the ears of the Muslims who at this point had just completed the conquest of North Africa and the Maghreb, and more importantly, were only a short distance to the south. Now, while Spain was essentially descending into civil war, just a small strait of water away in what will one day be the country of Morocco, and of course unbeknownst to Roderick and the rest of the Visigoth kingdom, was a man by the name of Musa ibn Nusayr. He was the governor of North Africa at this point, a man that was both a commander and a politician. It was he that captured Tangier and solidified the rule of the Caliphate in North Africa. But he wasn't always a man of lofty status. It was said that his father was taken prisoner in 633 when the Muslim conquest came to Mesopotamia. His father was made a slave, which of course sucks, but as far as slavery goes, he kind of lucked out as he was placed under the servitude of Abd al-Aziz ibn Marwan, who just happened to be the governor of Egypt and, for good measure, the son of the then reigning caliph. Musa's father must have done something right. Abd Aziz granted him freedom and became his esteemed patron, promoting him up the line. Musa grew up rubbing elbows with the upper echelon and was eventually made co-governor of Iraq. But he had a falling out over matters of money and nearly lost his head in the process. This wasn't going to be the end of our guy. He was given a chance at redemption by Abd al-Aziz, who paid off his debts and then put him to the task of subjugating Africa. Musa threw himself into the job. It is said that he led a brutal conquest, enslaving some 300,000 people along the way, yet history also remembers him as being a man of compromise. He knew that too strict a policy of control would only cause the indigenous people to rise in revolt again, like they had done to his predecessor, and so he used the carrot as well as the stick. He respected the customs of the Berbers, enticing them rather than forcing them to join, using dear God diplomacy, which worked wonders. Strange how a bit of mutual acknowledgement can just go such a long way. The Berbers began to convert to Islam, liking the idea of the sense of equality that it offered, and started signing up for the army just in droves, and not just as enlisted men, but also as officers. One of the most famous of these officers was Tariq ibn Ziyad, who was installed as governor of Tangier after it was taken in 708. There are conflicting stories on his ethnicity, but many historians feel he was one of the Berbers who Musa freed from slavery and then convinced him to join the ranks of the Muslim army. This must have been one of those paying it forward kind of moments. Again, Tariq must have done something right because he rose to prominence very quickly. By 709 to 710, most of North Africa was under the rule of the Caliphate, and by now, reports must have been reaching these two men that Spain was in a state of disorder. The nature of the Islamic conquest was that it needed new lands to plunder, and this must have made the peninsula a ripe target. Plus, the lands to the south were arid and very unpromising, so if you had a choice to battle fierce people and then end up claiming a chunk of the Sahara, or battle fierce people and then claim a chunk of fertile land in Spain, well, the choice was easy which way you're going to go. Some say, however, that the reason for invasion, and this could be completely myth or folklore, again, the records of this time period are not exactly complete, and the exact timeline may be off. The dates that I'm giving you, by the way, are based on the most likely consensus. But in any case, it was about 710 in the city of Ceuta, where an ex-Byzantine governor named Count Julian lived. This man had an axe to grind, and Hugh Kennedy picks up his tale. Hugh Kennedy, by the way, in his version, he's paraphrasing a more contemporary chronicler, and he refers to King Roderick as Rodrigo. Quote, according to the chronicler, Tariq wrote to Julian, paying him compliments and exchanging presents. Now, Julian had sent his daughter to Rodrigo, the Visigoth king of Spain, for her education and instruction, and Rodrigo had made her pregnant. When this news reached Julian, he said, I do not see how I can punish him or pay him back except by sending the Arabs against him. He then goes on to describe how Julian started to transport some of the men one evening and sent his ships back to the African coast to bring more the next. Tariq came in the last boat, and the fleet remained at Algeciras, which is one of the port cities, while the Muslim army marched north. It is impossible to know whether there is any truth in this story, or indeed whether Julian ever existed. It does not come from the usual repertoire of Arabic conquest narratives. However, it may reflect the reality of a widespread discontent with Rodrigo's kingship. End quote. It was approximately April of the year 711 that Tariq was commanded to take his army across into Spain. His force was a very modest 7,000 men, because you got to keep in mind this was initially more of a reconnaissance in force or a raid rather than a full-blown invasion. These men were comprised mostly of Berbers, again the indigenous inhabitants of the Maghreb, and as a side note, as many of these soldiers had come from what was once the Roman province of North Africa, which was named Mauritania. This is of course where we get the term Moors. Also, as a side note, as Tariq made his way from Tangier, he quickly spotted in the distance a great mountain across the water, which, as any good conqueror would do, he named it after himself. Jabal is the Arabic word for mountain, and so this mountain became known as Jabal al-Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. Come on, admit it, you do the same thing. Jabal al-Tariq is, of course, where we get the derivation of the mountain's modern name, which is Gibraltar. With his 7,000 men, he crossed into southern Spain and landed near the port city of Algeciras. Now, as I've mentioned, this was initially to be considered a large raid, and Tariq kept his men near the coast and by the port in case they needed to be evacuated. His presence was swiftly noted by the Visigoth. Roderick was at this time campaigning to secure his kingdom. He was up in northern Spain, in Navarre, in Basque country, attempting to bring the steadfast and resilient Basque into line. But upon hearing of the new invaders, he disengaged his attack and pressed his army south. Now, the reports are not consistent in regards to the size of his force, the upper-end estimates being in the 100,000 range, which is just crazy. More likely, he welded about 30 to 40,000 men. He moved down to the capital city of Toledo, where he was reinforced by some of his nobles who brought along their own private armies. And then together, at the head of this magnificent combined multitude, which easily outnumbered his opponent, he marched confidently on to fight the Moors. The man was in his moment. However, there is a legend that surrounds King Roderick, which most likely is propaganda that was written much later. It's one of these too good to be true kind of things, but at the very least, it makes for a very compelling read. And there are many versions of this story. It goes something like this, quote, "A king of Spain in ancient times built a tower in which he deposited a secret. He sealed a tower with a mighty padlock and laid upon his successors the obligation each by turns to add an extra padlock so as to preserve evermore inviolable whatever was concealed within. 26 kings came and went respecting his wishes. Then there succeeded a rash and headstrong young king named Roderick, resolved to penetrate the tower's secret, and against the advice of all of his counselors, he had the 27 padlocks opened. He then entered the chamber within, and upon its walls were painted Arab horsemen, scimitars at their belts, spears brandished in their right hands. In the middle of the room stood a table made of gold and silver set with precious stones. Upon it carved the words, 'This is the table of King Solomon, son of David, upon whom be peace.' There was an urn on the table which was found to contain a scroll of parchment. When this was unrolled, the following words were revealed. 'Whenever this chamber is violated and the spell contained in this urn is broken, the people painted on these walls will invade Spain, overthrow its kings, and subdue the entire land.'" End quote. So going back for a second, Roderick and the Visigoth army continued heading toward the Moors. Tariq, meanwhile, kept his forces in the south, and upon hearing of this incoming force, requested reinforcements. Musa ibn Nusayr sent in another 5,000 troops, to bring Tariq's fighting strength to about 12,000, but still, even with these additional forces, he was still vastly outnumbered. Now, the exact location, as well as the exact date of the Battle of Guadalete, as it was going to be known, is still a bit hazy. Some say it happened in the year 712. The Arabic sources have it pinned down to July 19th in the year 711. What is kind of known is that it occurred someplace around the city of Cadiz. The battle played out something like this. Roderick spotted Tariq's forces positioned on high ground awaiting him. They were kind of up on a hill, and when the Visigoth king saw this, he sent his army into a broad frontal attack, hoping to dislodge the enemy and let the math of his superior numbers do its thing. But halfway to the enemy, his noblemen, his allied people, basically halted their own private forces. If you recall, all the local lords within a Visigoth kingdom had their own loyal troops. So these guys basically just sat back and watched as Roderick and the main Visigoth army plowed uphill and right into Tariq's forces alone. It would seem that the hatred and animosity that Roderick had created had finally caught up with him. The Berber Arab force, while being outnumbered, were able to compensate for this. They held the high ground and were comprised of hardened veterans of many campaigns. They knew the essence of how to make an enemy bleed. They were professional in making short work of the Goths, who now found their flanks exposed. This couldn't have worked out better for the Muslim force, and part of me still feels that they must have made some sort of deal with the Visigoth nobles ahead of time, but the results were the same. Roderick, his army, his nobles, at least the ones that were still loyal to him, in one day were all wiped out. This defeat of Roderick and his army at Guadalete essentially crippled Visigoth resistance. The kingdom suddenly found itself on the proverbial ropes, and if this reversal of fortune seems a bit odd, keep in mind you're dealing with a more feudal society with more limited resources and reserves than you would have with, say, like the Roman Empire. You know, the Romans had this amazing ability to take defeat after defeat after defeat like they had at Trasimene or Cannae, and they just kept bringing in more manpower and reserves. Feudal states, on the other hand, and this is a general terms kind of statement here, some of the bigger nation states that occur later on down the line defy this rule, but usually they only had one major army to contend with military threats, and its destruction was ruinous. And again, if it seems strange that a single defeat can be so catastrophic, know that this scenario is not alone. There's other examples that have a very similar vibe. For example, the Battle of Hastings in 1066, where Harold and his Saxon army are just pummeled by William the Conqueror and his Normans, who then proceed to blitzkrieg and take over all of England. To give you another example, the Battle of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, Salah ad-Din mops the floor with the Crusader army, leaving the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem an easy target. Salah ad-Din would quickly go onwards to conquer the rest of the Levant, including Jerusalem, well, except for a few coastal cities, which he would later regret, but the point is that he faced limited resistance after this initial confrontation. So in light of current events, Tariq moved quickly. According to one chronicle, and this may not be entirely true, he was aided by Count Julian. If you remember, he's the one who sent his daughter to Roderick in the first place to get her education. And Roderick, at least according to the records, was then responsible for deflowering her. Julian, at this point, basically acted like a GPS. He gave the Muslims a layout of the land. Tariq, using this information, decided to move to the north, where he took the city of Asiha. He then divided his forces, sending one of his cavalry commanders, a one Mughith, with a mere 700 men, to take Cordoba. When he arrived at this city, Mughith began to interrogate the locals, who revealed to him that there were holes in the city walls that were big enough for a man to climb through, which is exactly what he and his force did. They managed to surprise and then kill off most of the garrison, and the remaining defenders retreated to a church which they fortified into a citadel. These poor men held out for approximately 3 months, all the while under siege. But when they realized that no one was coming to rescue them, they promptly surrendered. I'm guessing that these men didn't have a very happy ending. However, the point I'm trying to make is that the Visigoth kingdom was so poorly defended that even a handful of men could take a city. And to emphasize this, Tariq, meanwhile, pushed on to the capital city of Toledo, which at this point had been largely abandoned. He took the city and secured the land around it. He then stationed his men there for the winter of 711 to 712. And if you think about it, this is not a bad campaigning season. This is what a general would call a very auspicious beginning. Now, during this time, Musa ibn Nusayr was sitting back in North Africa and watching Tariq put on his dazzling performance. He had, after all, captured a port city and taken Cordoba and secured the capital, and of course took out a Visigoth army. Tariq had basically taken a raid and turned it into a war of conquest, and had managed not to die horribly in the process. Musa now realized that he was missing out on what was turning into a very lucrative affair. And so he mobilized 18,000 men, experienced veterans, mind you, and in June of 712, he brought these men into the port city of Algeciras, much like Tariq had done before him. Now, he spent the summer securing the southern tip of Spain, and then advanced to Seville, and finally onwards to Merida. Merida, being a substantial city, took a considerable amount of time via siege, in fact the entire winter of 712 to 713 to conquer, and with a considerable amount of bloodshed. Other areas opted to do it the easy way. They were given a diplomatic option, like the governor Theodomer of Murcia, which I've also heard as Murcia, which is an area in southeastern Spain. He was given a treaty, and the terms were fairly benign. He was given autonomy and the option for religious tolerance in exchange for paying his taxes on time, which of course beats being killed. And for the Arabs, it allowed them freedom to move on to other targets. In corporate America, we'd call this a win-win scenario. Theodomer also really didn't have much of a choice. It was said that he had to dress his women in soldiers' garb to give the appearance that his cities were actually defended. So after this successful campaign season, albeit it was a bit bloody, Musa eventually joined up with Tariq in Toledo. After exchanging the necessary pleasantries, they got down to the awkward affair of resolving who got what in terms of spoils. It was about now that Musa really had to pull rank. Apparently, they got into a real spat over the jeweled table that I mentioned earlier, the one that was considered to be the Table of Solomon. After a lot of back and forth, Musa ultimately got it, but not before Tariq managed to pull off one of the legs and replace it with a more rudimentary variant. It got really childish, but luckily nobody got their eye poked out. After Musa essentially got the lion's share and the two men hugged and made up, they set off to the northeast in 714 to capture the Ebro River Valley, and then they went on to take out Zaragoza and Lleida and Barcelona or Barcelona. However, they didn't stop there. They crossed the Pyrenees and took a chunk of southern France called Narbonne. The thought process here was that this area would be a launching pad for further conquest, as it became readily apparent to both men that there were still lands to be plundered on the other side of the mountains. So let me ask you this. If you were a war correspondent at this point in history, what would you report back at this point? Good chance is that you'd probably say that the conquest was going great, medals all around kind of thing. Now, the average person out there, if you do a fantastic job at whatever it is that you do, there's a good chance that you're going to get some sort of recognition. And if you're really lucky, you might even get promoted. However, news of Tariq and Musa's success began to worry the Caliph, who issued a command to recall both men back to Damascus. He was concerned, and perhaps rightfully so, that Musa was going to go ahead and carve out a kingdom for himself. Indeed, as Musa left Spain, he placed his own son, Abd al-Aziz ibn Musa, in charge, which some can argue was the beginning of a dynastic structure. In late 714, perhaps early 715, Musa and Tariq made the extended journey back to Damascus. The caliph who had just come to power at the time was Suleiman ibn Abd al-Malik, who, let's just say that he didn't have that warm, fuzzy center for Musa as many of his predecessor caliphs had. Suleiman, who straight out just didn't like Musa, stripped him of all of his titles and spoils and rendered him, at least in some stories, a complete and total beggar, abandoned by all, including his servants. But this wasn't going to be the final statement of Musa's last days. More on that in a bit. As for Tariq, he simply disappeared from the record, and I'm willing to guess his retirement, let's call it, wasn't exactly a benign one. Going back to Spain for a second, in his absence, Musa's son, Abd al-Aziz, continued the conquest of Spain, bringing most of Lusitania, which is what we think of as modern-day Portugal, and the northwestern areas such as Leon, under his control. It was at this point that he began to cash in on the perks of his success. Abd al-Aziz eventually found himself married to King Roderick's widowed wife. In some accounts, this woman is actually Roderick's daughter, which would probably make more sense if one is attempting to establish a lineage and the goal is to produce offspring. Whichever it was, the First Lady of Spain convinced him to inherit Visigoth customs. Hold on to a scepter, have people prostrate themselves in front of you, adorn yourself in regal clothing, and she even convinced him to wear a crown. This was too much for his Arab and Berber supporters, and when the Caliph, Suleiman, again the man who brought down Musa, heard about this, he put out a hit on Abd al-Aziz, who was thus promptly assassinated. And if the tale is to be true, he wasn't just killed. He was decapitated, his head put into a jar of vinegar, and then shipped back to Damascus. And check this out. When he got back there, Suleiman held a lavish feast for his father, Musa, dragging him out of the gutter for a night, and during the meal, in the midst of dinner conversation, the caliph presented Abd al-Aziz's head to him on a silver platter. Talk about driving home a point in a kind of insanely cruel way. Okay, so meanwhile, far to the west, the conquest of Spain was entering into a more consolidated phase. Much like the conquest of Persia, the Muslims would first take the main cities and roads, and then slowly expand into the more rural areas. By 716 to 720, most of Spain was taken. And while this was going on, more and more settlers were coming in. The Arabs would tend to settle in the more urban areas, and the Berbers would choose more pastoral grounds. But in the north, in the Cantabrian Mountains and the Pyrenees, the indigenous peoples of places like Asturias and Cantabria and Navarre put up a fierce defense and managed to maintain their independence. The Muslim conquest was never really able to penetrate this area, or if it did, they didn't really stay for very long. In fact, any conflict that repulsed the invaders was immediately glorified and made headline news. At the Battle of Covadonga in 717 or 718, again the records are not exact, some claim it happened as late as 722, a Visigoth noble who was being hunted by the Moors for inciting rebellion, some say he might have been actually a member of King Roderick's court. His name was Pelayo, and he managed to band together the people of the mountains together under his banner, and he went on to oppose and then defeat what was considered a massive, and I say that with quotes, a massive Muslim force that came after him, which, if some of the sources are to be believed, consisted of an army of over 150,000 Moors, which is almost assuredly made up to sensationalize and add some sort of drama. Pelayo's fight, I will give you this, and the resilience of the people of the northern mountains did establish a strong Christian bastion in the north. Later historians even regaled his exploits and the exploits of those people as the beginnings of a reconquista, which is completely overblown. The Battle of Covadonga was probably a modest battle at best, and the concept of reconquest, at least in terms of a broad religious event, was centuries away. This whole event was likely inflated as propaganda by later historians. I guess if you look at it from the perspective of the Visigoths, who were on the decisively losing end of this invasion, any victory, especially if it's considered a Christian one, is going to make it into the history books.